Lisa, Janet said, her voice level. What a surprise. The florist, Lisa remarking. Not standing up. I assume you're the one who's been putting the weeds on the tables. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. Jack stood between them, sensing that the architecture of his new life was about to be tested by a very old ghost. Chapter 16. The Morality Clause. 2. Lisa Page's proposal wasn't just a request, it was a threat. She had managed to buy a minority share of the building's debt, and she was hinting that a refresh of the restaurant would be in the landlord's best interest. She's trying to lie her way back in, Janet said that night, pacing the bedroom. She wants to tear down everything we built because she couldn't have it herself. I know, Jack sighed. But if she pushes the board, they might start looking into the old deeds. The Beaumont bequest was very specific about character. The situation was further complicated when Larry Dallas decided to join forces with Lisa. It's the dream team, Jack, Larry shouted through the restaurant window. She brings the style, I bring the charm. Larry, you're a photographer for dental journals now, Jack yelled back. But the real challenge came when the board announced a second inspection. This time, it wasn't about Jack's living arrangements. It was about his business ethics. Lisa had filed a complaint claiming Jack had secured the bequest through fraudulent emotional manipulation of the late Professor Beaumont. She's using the Furley lie against us, Jack realized. She's going to tell them that I pretended to be someone I wasn't, just to get the restaurant. The night before the hearing, Jack and Janet sat on the balcony. For the first time, they considered the possibility of losing it all. We could just tell them the whole truth, Janet suggested. From the beginning. The roommates, the lies to Furley, the whole circus. They'll revoke the deed, Janet. The morality clause was about truth. I wasn't being truthful. You were protecting us, Jack. That's a different kind of truth. Chapter 17. The Final Foundation. The hearing was held in a mahogany-lined boardroom. Lisa Page sat on one side, looking victorious. Larry Dallas sat behind her, trying to look like a legal advisor. Jack and Janet sat on the other side, holding hands under the table. Mr. Tripper, the head of the board, began. The allegation is that you deceived Professor Beaumont regarding your personal lifestyle and character in order to secure a business asset. Specifically, that you led people to believe you were, that you were not interested in women. Jack stood up. He looked at Lisa, who was smirking. Then he looked at Mr. Furley, who had been called as a witness and was currently wearing a suit that looked like a disco ball had exploded. I did lie, Jack said, his voice clear. I lied for 3 years. I lied to my landlord, I lied to my neighbors, and occasionally I lied to myself. A gasp went through the room. But I didn't lie to Professor Beaumont, Jack continued, pulling a small, yellowed letter from his pocket. This is a letter he wrote to me a month before he passed. He knew about Janet and Cindy. He knew about the Brotherhood facade. He said, Jack, a man who can convince a whole building of one thing while keeping his heart true to another is a man who knows how to manage a kitchen. Cooking is just the art of making people believe the butter isn't there. Jack handed the letter to the board. Lisa's smirk vanished. The lie wasn't about the restaurant, Jack said, turning to Lisa. The lie was about safety, but the restaurant, that's the most honest thing I've ever done. Every plate is a confession. Every meal is an invitation. The board deliberated for only 5 minutes. Lisa Page was dismissed. Her design firm deemed a conflict of interest. Larry Dallas was escorted out after he tried to sell the board members exclusive pictures of their own shoes. As they walked out into the Santa Monica sun, Jack and Janet were met by Mr. Furley. Jack, Furley said, looking confused. That letter, it said you weren't, but I thought. Gladys and I. Mr. Furley, Jack said, putting a hand on his shoulder. I'm a man of many mysteries, but the biggest mystery is how I ever got lucky enough to live in your building. Furley beamed, adjusting his ascot. Well, that's true. It takes a certain kind of guy to handle the threads. Chapter 18. The Heritage of 201. 20 years later, the Santa Monica skyline had changed, but apartment 201 remained a pocket of preserved memories. The wooden balcony had been reinforced, and the wicker coffee table had long since been replaced by a heavy oak one, but the soul of the place was intact. Jack and Janet were no longer the frantic youngsters scrambling to hide roommates in the bathroom. They were the established couple of the boardwalk: Jack, the silver-haired grandfather of fusion cuisine, and Janet, whose floral empire now spanned 3 cities. One autumn afternoon, a sharp, rhythmic knock echoed through the door. "Jack, can you get that?" Janet called from the study, where she was finalizing the arrangements for their 25th anniversary gala. Jack, currently graying but still possessing that same mischievous twinkle in his eyes, opened the door. Standing there was a young woman with a familiar mop of blonde hair and a suitcase that looked like it had seen better days. "Hi," the girl said, her voice a perfect echo of Cindy's youthful enthusiasm. "I'm looking for apartment 201. My mom said. Well, she said this was the place where everything started. "Sophie," Jack breathed, recognizing Cindy's daughter. "Uncle Jack," Sophie cried, dropping her bags and throwing her arms around him. "She said you might have a room?" Jack looked back at Janet, who had appeared in the hallway, her face lighting up with joy. He then looked at the extra bedroom, the one that had once been Cindy's, then a study, and was now essentially a guest suite. "Well," Jack said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "there is a catch, Sophie. We have a very strict set of rules in this house." "Rules?" Sophie asked, looking a bit nervous. "First," Janet said, stepping forward and hugging her. "And second, if you ever run into a man in a lime green leisure suit, though they're mostly in museums now, you feed his turtle. No questions asked." Sophie laughed, the sound filling the apartment with a vibrant, new energy. As she began to unpack, Jack and Janet stood on the balcony, watching the Pacific. "Here we go again," Janet whispered, leaning her head on Jack's shoulder. "Not quite," Jack said. "This time, the truth is already moved in. We're just adding a new wing." Chapter 19. The Master Class. The anniversary gala for Tripper's Table was the event of the decade. The boardwalk was closed off, and a massive tent had been erected, filled with the scent of lilies and slow-roasted duck. Sophie was serving as the lead hostess, her natural charm making her an instant favorite with the guests. But the night held one final test for the Tripper legacy. A young food critic, known for his acerbic wit and his penchant for deconstructing established icons, had been seated at the head table. His name was Victor Dallas, Larry's son, though he had spent the last decade trying to distance himself from his father's flamboyant failures. "Mr. Tripper," Victor said as Jack approached the table, "I've read your book, The Art of the Confession. You claim that honesty is the foundation of flavor, but isn't it true that your entire career started with a masquerade?" The table went silent. Janet tightened her grip on her wine glass. Larry Dallas, sitting a few seats away, looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Jack didn't flinch. He sat down opposite Victor and poured himself a glass of water. "It started with a need for a roof over our heads, Victor," Jack said, "and it continued because we found something worth protecting. But you're right, there was a masquerade. And for a long time, I thought that was the weak point in the structure." He looked around the room, at Furley and Gladys, now 90, and still dancing, at Cindy and Mike, and at Janet. "But then I realized," Jack continued, "that the masquerade was just the scaffolding. You need scaffolding to build something high. You need it to hold the weight while the foundation sets. But eventually, the scaffolding comes down. What's left is the building. And Victor, if you want to judge the building, don't look at the wood. We used to hold it up 25 years ago. Taste the food." Jack signaled to the kitchen. A plate of simple, perfectly seared scallops was placed before Victor. "No fireworks," Jack said. "No atmosphere machines. Just the truth." Victor took a bite. He closed his eyes. The room held its breath. It's balanced," Victor whispered, his sharp edges finally softening. "It's honest." He looked at his father, Larry, who was beaming with pride. For the first time, the Dallas legacy and the Tripper legacy found a common ground not in a lie, but in the simple, undeniable reality of a well-cooked meal. Chapter 20. The Vow Revisited. The final guests had departed, leaving the boardwalk to the quiet company of the moon and the tide. Jack and Janet walked back to apartment 201, their hands entwined, their steps synchronized by decades of shared rhythm. They didn't turn on the lights. They didn't need to. They knew every inch of their home by heart. They sat on the sofa, the same spot where Jack had once tried to see how Lisa Page looked on the sofa, and watched the waves. 25 years, Janet said, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. And we're still standing, Jack added. No weak floorboards, no sinking building. Jack? Janet turned to him, her face illuminated by the silver moonlight. Do you ever miss it? The scramble? The frantic hiding? The pen pals? Jack thought for a moment. He thought of the laughter that had been fueled by fear, and the intimacy that had been forged in the fire of shared deception. I miss the energy of it, he admitted, but I wouldn't trade the peace we have now for all the soufflés in the world. Being honest with the world was the hardest thing I ever did, Janet. But being honest with you? That was the easiest. He leaned in, and the kiss was no longer a promise of a renovation. It was the celebration of a finished masterpiece. As the Santa Monica sun began to rise on a new decade, the architecture of a lie was finally, irrevocably gone. In its place stood a heritage of truth, a home built on the only foundation that never cracks, a love that learned to knock on the door, stay for the kisses, and eventually build a world that was exactly, perfectly, honestly its own. Chapter 21. The Beaumont Journal.